Welcome to the Monos Pod with Tino and Matt. What's up, Matt?
It's going well, going good. Looking forward to outfield, very deep position.
It's gonna be crazy. We are doing our top
You
10.
saw I have Mariner, so there's
Nice. You gonna get the
a couple on here today.
new one?
That's awesome. It's really cool looking, huh?
I like the pullover one is cool. Um, so we will do, as Matt previewed, we will do our top 10 Dynasty prospect outfielders. I know there will be a little bit of controversy on both lists. Today should be fun. We'll try to get through those 10 and potentially mention some of the others that fell just outside of the top 10. As we always do. Oh, looks like Kershaw's re-signing with the Dodgers.
Oh wow.
Um, as we typically do, uh, you know, we're not talking about defense here, right? And we are as far as how it impacts the number of at bats players get, but we're not. The lists that come out are incorporating defense and offense, like Pipeline, like BP. We're talking about dynasty fantasy baseball, so like a Pete Crow Armstrong or a Drew Jones type, right? That are valued for that defense are going to fall on our list because this is dynasty fantasy baseball, not real life baseball with defense. So with that, I know you previewed it with me over text and said you're going to have a little bit of controversy with your list. Does it start with number one?
It does not start with number one.
Okay.
Um, my top three or four aren't controversial. After that, it gets controversial. A potential Roy Rookie of the Year is number 9 on my list. So
Is that
so
Evan Carter?
yep.
Nice. Let's start at one.
Yeah, I have Jackson Churio as number one. I what I actually did is I tiered out the players first.
Mhm.
I have him kind of in I have a tier of three, and then within that three, I have him in his own tier,
Mhm.
largely because he's the best bet for 30-30. And with fantasy baseball, you want to cover all the categories. You want hitters that could have that power, that speed. Churio has it. I was a little hesitant with Churio last year because of his high K rates. And what everybody's talking about this year is his ability in the minors after our preview last year to adjust. His strikeout rate was under 20%. His walk rate's still a little low. I would say that's his weakness with his speed. I think that's something that can be taught. I think he recognizes pitches well. So he's definitely floor, you know, 60 hit, 60 power, 60 speed, but I've seen it ranged higher there. But I just wanted to say that that's the floor, and that's why I'm feel pretty good at putting him at this place. He also has a proximity. It's nice that he signed the large contract with Milwaukee, so there's no reason for them not to hold him back. Milwaukee is rebuilding, obviously from the Burns trade. So there's no reason for them to want to be uber competitive this year. So I think he's going to get his shot right from the start, unless he struggles in spring. But even then, I think there's going to be a long time of patience for him. So yeah, I just like Churio a lot. One thing I wanted to point out, BA has been running really cool articles about how do we identify minor league players that are going to sorry, my phone's ringing here. How are we going to identify minor league players that have succeeded and then go back and look and see what were the traits, right? And they started doing that with your guy Vlad Jr. And saying, well, he obviously was the pedigree guy, but also let's look under the hood and see what those traits are. So one of the ones that they've remained consistent with and seems to have stood the test of time has to do with hard hit rate, not only average exit velocity, but but considering 90 percentile. And then moving to contact rates, and it doesn't have to be elite with contact rates, but contact rates over 70%, and then chase rates. And it is really interesting because last year, the two players that met the qualifications kind of that they set the bar for were Corbin Carroll and Gunnar Henderson. I think Carroll was a little bit down on EV, but basically if you round it off that way, that's the case. Then let me go here. And then the year before, the three that stood out, again, using the same standard, were Julio Rodriguez, Bobby Witt Jr., and Adley Rutschman.
Sure.
And those were right at the top.
Right.
So yeah, it's, so people that we may get hyped up about, like a Stephen Kwan, he proves that maybe he meets a couple of those metrics, right? But he doesn't hit the EV one at all, right? And that was the warning about him. He's going to be an average, solid player, and he's going to be that defensive player too, that Gold Glove in left field, but he isn't necessarily going to be that fantasy star. So why I mention this is, if we go with Churio's under the hood stats in those areas when it comes to hard hit, chase rate, and so forth, it's kind of around Bobby Witt's metrics. So I thought that was a cool comp, that he's kind of Bobby Witt in center field. Maybe Witt may hit the power a little more. Maybe Churio will have the hit tool a little better, but he basically matches the metrics in minors with Bobby Witt. So I feel confident in having him kind of with the Bobby Witt in center field for me.
Are there any warning signs or pitfalls with Churio for you, or is he kind of a slam dunk? Let's say 25-25 as his floor.
Yes, 25-25 as his floor. I think he has the high floor and then the super high ceiling. And a lot of this has to do with age too, how he's performing at his age against people that are 4 years older than him.
Sure. I too have Churio at 1. I agree with, pretty much everything you said. I think it is interesting that, I think we instinctually think of hard hit and exit velocity and things like chase rate and zone contact rate. We think of those things and we see those things and we apply it to each individual player, but we often don't take the time to understand applying those filters across baseball and then translate kind of what those filters mean over time, right? So BA is doing the work for us to teach us the lesson that we don't take the time or use the energy to go see. We all have our own kind of thresholds, but it is interesting to see it applied to the whole. I don't have a whole lot to add with Churio. I am on the bottom end of what you said as far as tools go. I have 60 hits, 60 power, 65 run, 60 field, which ends up as a 65 overall for me. I think he's an all-star. I don't think he's Acuna. I think Acuna is a more talented player overall, but I think he supplies a similar sort of, 5-tool excitement, right? And I think he probably peaks out at low 30s home runs. I don't see the elite power in Churio, I think, but he has the speed and the ability, say, to go 40 doubles, 12 triples, 30 home runs, which elevates his OPS to close to 900 at that point, right? The interesting thing for me as well with Milwaukee is, does Milwaukee see Churio as a leadoff hitter, or do they see him as a number 3? Because if he's a leadoff hitter for fantasy purposes, then you're looking at maybe 80 RBIs, especially on a team that's not going to have a great offense. If he's a number 3 hitter, and he hits 30 home runs and has 30 steals. Now it's 100 runs, 100 RBIs, 30 homers, 30 steals, and he's up there with Acuna and J Rod and some of the others as a top five outfielder or a top five, even top five player in fantasy baseball. So I do think there's a little question about his where he plays or where he hits in that lineup, what Milwaukee's offense looks like moving forward, and again, is he going to get to a 65 power, right? Does he have 65 power in his bat? I don't know that answer. I also have his risk as low. He signed the big contract, 8 years, $82 million extension in December, which is a record for a player with no major league service time. Clearly, he is their future in Milwaukee. The one last thing I'll say, and this doesn't, obviously Julio is in this same bucket, is the really lower walk rate players scare me a little, because if the walk rate is higher, you can, especially with regards to speed and runs, like steals and runs, you can kind of bank a decent number. But if a player doesn't take walks, then you're relying upon their ability to hit for a high average to keep some of those numbers at elite levels. So that's the one thing that is a bit concerning for me, but I don't, as you said, I think Churio is such a talent that that's something that he can learn over time. They're probably just letting him swing the bat essentially right now. But yeah, no qualms with Churio at 1. I didn't really hesitate having him there. I think it's pretty much for me a slam dunk. I assume we have the same number 2. Who's at 2 for you?
I have 2 players at the second tier. I'm not going to argue which should be first, but I have my own personal preference, largely because of the shirt I'm wearing. But I have Dylan Cruz and Wyatt Langford at 2 and 3. I see both as extremely high floor players. They both will probably play this year. Langford probably before Cruz. Cruz was kind of the undisputed #1 expected pick in the college draft last year out of LSU. He probably had the best collegiate performance of any hitter in the past 20-30 years. He has an extremely high hit tool, hits the ball extremely hard. Even though he struggled a little bit in Double-A last year, he still had elite EV. He was at 93% average EV, so he's hitting the crap out of the ball. I think some of the lazy, I would call lazy analysis, put Cruz down because of 60, 70 at bats in Double-A. But he was hitting the crap out of the ball. His BABIP was low there. Harrisburg isn't necessarily, it's not a great park. It's not a bad park, but there were issues there in Harrisburg. I think I sent you the article last night. I didn't know this, but Washington basically fired at the end of the season all of their hitting instructors. And a lot of it was focused on what was going on in Harrisburg. And they're trying to revamp what they're doing. And I think a lot of that reflects on Cruz's performance and Wood's performance and House's performance at Double-A. There seemed to be a pattern of some swing and miss, lack of recognition of certain pitches. So I have Cruz at 2. I have him at 65, 70 hits, 60 power, 55 run. The only hesitation I have with Cruz is the team I just mentioned, my favorite team, which does not have a good record with developing youth. So another player is going to come up soon, which I don't have any concerns as far as floor with Cruz. When we bring up Wood, there's definitely going to be concerns there and I would largely base that up because of the Nationals.
I too have Cruz at 2. It is, I think, bad scouting, I think, to take, the 156 plate appearances that he had in the pros last year after being drafted and make these broad stroke assumptions about, he couldn't hit spin as well in Double-A, or, his K rate was 24.4%. in the minor leagues last season. That's not really who Dylan Cruz is as a player. I have his hit as a 60, his power at 65 and his run at 55, and then his field at 55 as well. I have 4 players in that top tier. I have Churio, Cruz, and then the other 2. They're all overall 65s for me in that first tier. The difference, I think, each one of those 4 has a different tool that's better than the other 3. For me, with Cruz, I like his hit tool better than the other 3. I think his hit tool is slightly better. I gave him a 60 like Churio, but I trust his hit tool a little bit more. Maybe part of that is because he was so successful in college. And I think he does have a little bit more power. I don't think he's the athlete that Churio is, but I think he gets to his power a little better ultimately. But obviously he doesn't have that 30-40 steal potential. And so that's what puts him below Churio instead of above. And then there has to be questions about his organization. There has to be questions about what's going to happen moving forward with the Nationals' ability to develop hitters, right? And that's a little bit scary when you're invested in these players. So I love Cruz. I do obviously have Cruz above Langford, above Wood, above Carter, above a lot of the big names. You just can't get away from the kind of hitter he was at LSU, right? And what does that translate to ultimately? I think he's probably a 290 to 300 hitter with 30 to 35 home runs consistently. And I see him hitting second or third in that lineup for the next 10 years. And I think he's a pretty safe, like 100 run, 100 RBI type of player. Again, he doesn't have the ceiling of Churio from a speed standpoint, but I think his floor is really, really high as a hitter. I love Cruz. I think he's great. Who's at 3?
I have Wyatt Langford.
Mm-hmm.
Is that who you have?
It is.
You want to take off since you just traded for, or yeah, you just drafted him in FYPD. So
I did. Sure. I think, so Langford was the number 4 overall pick. The Rangers took him out of Florida, Florida Gators, U of F. He's 22 years old, right-handed hitter, great athlete, 6'1", 225, well built, probably plays left field, could play center in a pinch, but he's there for his bat. I gave him a 60 hit and a 70 power with 55 run. Obviously the tool grade that I gave him is a little higher than Cruz in the power department. I think Cruz ultimately proves out to be a more consistent hitter. I like Cruz swing a little bit more. With Langford, a lot of it is muscle and loft, whereas I think Cruz just has is a more talented swing. But that said, Langford is a good athlete. He's in Texas. Texas for right-handed power is a good place to hit. At least it was last season. I don't know if they were pushing wind through that stadium or what, but it proved to be good for right-handed power. He's going to play right away. I expect him to be their opening day left fielder. There's no reason for them to hold him back. He's just a powerful dude. He looks a little mechanical to me. I know they say that he has an easy right-handed stroke. There's a little, it's not as smooth to me as I would like to see. Maybe it's because he's right-handed. You don't see that really smooth right-handed swing all the time. But I think he's a lock to hit 25 to 35 home runs most years. But I don't know if the hit tool is such that you can count on him hitting 280, 290. I think Langford may have some 260 with 35 home run types of years, and may have some 290 with 30 home run types of years. Whereas I think Cruz is much more of a metronome. I think he's going to be more consistent over time. So Langford's a great prospect, tons of power. There's only one other hitter on this list that I think has more power than Wyatt Langford does. But I also think, despite being the number 4 pick, he had, 200 plate appearances where he went off 10 homers, 12 steals, 1.157 OPS. But people are so quick to jump on these bandwagons when a player has a great third of a season at the end of their college career. It's the scouting from, from the point that they're 16, 17 years old until now that should determine what we think of this player, not what they did in 200 at bats in the minor leagues. It's the Tamar Johnson argument, right? So if we take into account things that we know about Langford before he arrived in Texas, I think there are more questions than people are willing to admit to. That said, he's still the number 3 outfield prospect. Again, I expect him to start in left field and probably hit pretty high in that Texas lineup right away. But he's just below Cruz for me at 3. Anything to add for you with Wyatt Langford?
Not really. I think it's a good point. Even if we go back and just look at these draftees or these signings in that 1/3 of the season, right? People get really excited about the stats, but they're just such a small sample size, right? And there's people, I think, like Cahill Watson, he had a great opening year, right? And then all of a sudden he falls off. So I think they're indicators, but you need to have that base be the scouting coming out, right? And Langford was, there were people that were debating whether he should be ahead of Cruz or not, before Langford's performance. That's why I have him in the same tier. But yeah, I think the point you make about stats is to be very careful with these guys with the small sample size.
Who's number 4?
Number 4, staying with the Nats, I have James Wood at number 4. Wood was a 2nd-round pick. San Diego, he's 6'6", 6'7", incredible athlete. He's I think when we went to the futures, as far as athleticism and seeing a player play, he's the one that stood out the most. He was just different than the other players on the field as far as how he ran, how he swung. He was he just stood out with his athleticism. So he's the interesting thing about him is his elite power because of that. What had the initial attraction and why he seemed to be the centerpiece of the Nats trade of Soto to San Diego was, despite that, the athleticism and kind of the big swing, his swing and miss wasn't that bad, right? So his K rate was, I think, under 20 when he was with San Diego. And he's always had, like, if we're to make a comp of like a extremely big athletic player, like a Cruz, like a De La Cruz, he also beats both of those. I think he has the K problem that both of those have, but he also beats both in walk rate, right? So he's always had a good eye. The problem with Wood, once he went with the Nats, he did well in A ball. I think the strikeout rate was 26%, between 24 and 26. Once he goes to Double-A, he starts getting in the 30s, right? 33%, 34%. The scouts and who have commented on it say that a lot had to do with his lack of recognition of spin. So his off-speed numbers were ridiculous, right? I think one off-speed pitch, I think he was at 50% rate there, right? Which is not good at all. So that's a concern. But at the same time, his chase rate was not bad. It was in the 20s. So that's a good indicator there. So the problem seems to be recognizing spin. Is that something teachable? Why I have him high and why this isn't so much a big concern is because he's done it before, right? He's had good contact rates at lower levels. I think San Diego, what I heard is they did a good job of bringing his hands in and shortening his swing up. And again, this goes back to the Nats. Well, why aren't they continuing that training, right?
Right.
Why aren't they developing him in that way to improve his hits? To me, I just see kind of the Harrisburg philosophy was just try to hit the shit out of the ball.
Right.
For Wood, for House, and for Cruz, and it didn't. That's not going to help you recognize spin.
Right.
That's not going to help you make contact with spin. So Keith Law, from his sources say people are grading him his speed higher than what some sites have him. So BA has him at 55. Um, um, Law said some people are grading him at 70 or 80 speed, just because of how athletic he is. Um, so yeah, he's going to be a fun one to watch this year to see if the Nats improve how they're going to develop their players. The last thing to say about him too, he's 20 years old, right? So he didn't have college like Langford and Cruz.
Right.
He's 20 years old facing in AA pitchers who are 4 years older than him. So there is still hope as far as that K rate goes.
Mm-hmm. So he's also my number 4. He's the first high risk outfielder I have. Um, the so I should say, for at least for my list, the way that I approach this is I do value ceiling and upside over um, over floor, and I do that in large part because I feel like if I need, as an example, if I need an outfielder on my fantasy team, I can go find a high floor, low ceiling dude super easily, right? I can go trade for an Ian Happ, or I can even like trade for a Teoscar Hernandez or someone like that, where I know I'm getting 25 homers and 75 runs and 90 RBIs and sprinkle in 8 to 10 steals. Like those guys are easy to acquire in fantasy, but a 40 home run or a 40-30, 40-40 potential, outfielder like a James Wood is not acquirable if he hits his ceiling. And so to me, that player is more valuable in the long run. Or that prospect is more valuable to me than the low floor prospect is, right? Which is why I have length or have Wood at 4. I do have concerns about his swing and miss. If it's swing and miss at stuff that's spin that's low in the zone, or really anything that's low in the zone, right? So it was splitters, it was changeups, it was sliders. And if he's got a hole at the bottom of the zone, that's not going to be great, for him moving forward. That said, say he can hit mostly fastballs and maybe a little bit of something else, he's still, 30 to 35 home runs with the type of power that he has. And he's going to steal bags because of his raw speed. So, I have a hit as a 50. And I think if he just gets to a 50, he's going to hit 35 home runs because the power is so prodigious. I have put his power at 75. So he has the highest power grade of any player that I've graded out so far in our conversations. And then his run as a 65. I expect his run to probably become closer to a 60 as he becomes a major leaguer, but right now it's 65. And then his field is a 55 because he has range in the outfield that others don't because he is so fast and his strides are so long. He's the last one in this top tier. Like I said, even if he does continue to strike out at a 30% rate, he's still a 250, 350, 850 OPS type of player with 30 home runs and probably 20 stolen bases. So there is huge value in James Wood, and he will get to a lot of the value because of the athleticism. The only real question is if the K rate, can he get the K rate to a place where he can hit 40 to 45 home runs instead of the 30 to 35? But incredible prospect. Again, he's at 4 instead of 1 for me because of the potential for the swing and miss and the floor dropping out. But the reality is, statistically speaking, he has the highest ceiling of any player we're going to talk about today, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Is it time for controversy?
Well, why don't you, I brought up wood, so are you ready for a controversy one yourself?
Uh,
Um,
yeah, I think so.
okay.
So that was the end of my 65 overall tier. Next is 60 overall for me, and I have four players there. The first one is at number 5 is Max Clark. Max Clark was the number 3 overall pick in last year's draft. Pipeline has him one spot above Wood at 13. He's 19 years old, drafted out of Indiana High School, left-handed hitter, 6'1", 205 is what he's listed at. Max Clark is very talented. I think he comes up in 26 for the Tigers. I have his risk as mid. The only reason I have his risk as mid is I think there are questions about his power right now, but the questions about the power is not because of the athleticism, it's because of the swing plane, right? His swing is geared for line drives at this point in time, not for power. It's something I think we see a lot of players tweak, but he he's natural. He's a natural ball player in the way that I think Dylan Cruz is. Where it's just everything with Max Clark is pretty. The other thing is there's an explosiveness to his athleticism that gets him closer to a Churio, right? Where it's close to 70 speed. I have it at 65, but I've seen it close to 70, and he's such a natural hitter. I love him. I have his hit as a 65, power 55, speed 65, field 60. I think he's the center fielder of the future for the Tigers. What I see from Clark is more, again, 40 homers, 15 triples, somewhere between, let's say, 15 and 25 homers, and then 20 stolen bases, where in an OPS league, Clark is still at 840, 850 OPS guy, but he's not going to give you the homers that you want, right? I also think Clark, the same question that we have for Churio, you can apply to Clark. Is he a one hitter or is he a three hitter? Because if he's a one hitter, he's going to score 100 plus runs, but he's going to give you 70 RBIs. If he's a three hitter, then it's 100 and 100. So that to me is going to, in some ways, determine his value. And I have his risk as a mid just because he's a 19-year-old, and I have power questions with him. But I think he's a pretty much a lock to be to above average or plus hit tool major leaguer with speed and some semblance of power. If he finds more power this season, if he's made a swing change and it hasn't hurt him, watch out, because he has the ability to move all the way to the top of this list.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have Clark at 5?
I do not have Clark at 5, but I affirm everything you say. This next tier for me, once you're past Wood, I just kind of group the players according to traits.
Sure.
So I'll make a statement about Clark. I think Evan Carter is a poor man's Max Clark, not the other way around. Um, I think you're right on with his hit tool. I think that's his second strength. His first strength is speed. I have him at 70 speed. So I have Carter, Max Clark, and Victor Scott, the second, grouped together as the speed guys. And I think in the long run, especially if Carter tries to put on weight and tries to tap into power, his speed's going to go down. I see Clark's speed maintaining. So I could easily see him as a 20, 40 to 50 steal, 20 home run, 40, 50 steal guy with a BA or on base percentage that is not going to hurt you, that is actually going to help you. So 270, 280, if he really taps into a high average hitter, right? That's how he came out. He's incredibly athletic. Compared to a Carter, he is a lot more athletic coming out of the draft. He's 2 years younger. What's interesting is, I do have questions about his power. So his EV on BA's list of the top 100 was towards the bottom in the 86%. But so was Evan Carter's, right? And Evan Carter is a few years older than he is. So So I think Pipeline is correct in having Clark high. I think early on some lists even had him in the top 10, and I wouldn't even mind that overall as a player.
Mhm.
I think he's getting overlooked. I and Detroit's new GM, I trust him. People kind of laughed because of the 160 at bats of Langford that the Tigers chose Clark over Langford, but who knows how that's going to turn out, right? Um, so yeah, I'm with you as far as what Clark could offer with his ceiling.
Mhm. It is interesting to comp him to Evan Carter because of those similarities. I like you. I think he's an explosive athlete, and I tend to, we've talked about this when you look at the very best players in Major League Baseball, right? The very best players at the top of all fantasy lists. There's a certain amount of explosion in their athleticism that you have to look for, right? Like just the top names come to mind: Acuna, J Rod, Witt, Carroll. These guys all have like a quick twitch and an explosiveness that's really that you see immediately, right? Like my 10-year-old daughter can see it watching one inning of an all-star game. And Max Clark, James Wood has that. Jackson Churio has that. Max Clark, that to me is the differentiator between him and Carter. The biggest one is he has an explosiveness that Carter doesn't. I think my comp for Carter is like a Cedric Mullins with the plus hit tool, right? Where there's speed to burn and power, but not the eye popping power like a James Wood. It's more of a power that you don't really expect to find. But I trust Clark. I think Clark's such a natural player. I'm sad to have traded him, but I needed to make that deal in our league. Uh, do you want to go with six? You want me to go with six?
Um, well, my 5 and 6, I grouped together. And I'm not sure if he's still on lists. So I put him here. I have Jason Dominguez at 5,
Mm-hmm.
and I have Roman Anthony at 6.
Uh-huh.
I grouped them both together just because I think they're solid, 50s across the board. Um, I'm not confident in the high ceiling of either one of them,
Mm-hmm.
but they potentially can offer a high floor, especially where they're at. Anthony in Boston, Anthony is proving to be all fields power. He could knock it off the big monster the other way. He's he's kind of that twitchy elite athlete coming out, but doesn't necessarily have the elite speed that a Clark has or a Wood has, or nor does he have the power of a Wood. So I have Anthony at 6, and Dominguez. I don't think there's too much to say about him just because he's gotten so much talk. I think he proved his skill and talent when he did come up. He is going to have a great park to play in. The thing is, with the pressure that the Yankees have and the trades they've made, where's he going to end up this year once he's healthy, right? It would have been interesting if he didn't get hurt, if he didn't have the Tommy John, what would the Yankees have done? So I'm higher on Dominguez than I was last year. I think he's proven himself this year as I think he always was kind of that high floor player. So those two are my floor players at 5 and 6, kind of in the middle of the group here.
I do not have Dominguez in my top 10. I have a big group of outfield prospects that are 55 overall for me. Uh, Numbers 9 and 10 are on my list are 55 overall. I think you can just pick and choose out of that group. That's where Dominguez lands for me. There's the swing and miss is still scary, and the passivity is scary for me. I also think that it's hard to differentiate between when people evaluate Dominguez and you listen, how much of it is with a hype when he was 16 and how much of it is who he truly is as a player? Are we able to objectively evaluate who Jason Dominguez is? And then to your point, is the hype and New York going to help or hurt him in his performance? There are some other players I would prefer, both from a talent standpoint and just a situation, organizational standpoint. I have Anthony at 6. I really like him as a prospect. As you said, explosive athlete, strong as heck, big power to all fields. I have his power as a 65. So I've hit 55, power 65, run 55, field 55. The reason why his hit is a 55 and not a 50 for me is I incorporate his ability to draw walks, and he has a very, very good eye at the plate. And so if you're talking about a hitter who can discern, who can see spin and makes really good swing decisions and is hitting the ball hard to all fields, that to me is, even if, say, he runs a higher fly ball rate, right? And I know he's been hitting the ball on the ground a bit and they want to get the ball in the air more. But even a player, as an example, that hits the ball in the air more than on the ground, you're still talking about 250. This is why I love walks so much if they translate in the majors. He might hit 250 with a 360, 365 OBP. And that all of a sudden that OPS is all the way up at 850 because his ability to draw walks. And so Roman Anthony to me is a, kind of average type hitter, average meaning like, okay, with 25 to 35 home runs, double-digit steals, and a high OBP. And to me, that's a really valuable player. If you compare he as a hitter versus Marcelo Mayer, right? I take Anthony as a hitter 10 out of 10 times. I think Mayer's value is wrapped up in playing shortstop, whereas Anthony's value is wrapped up in the power and the ability to draw walks. So I'm high on Anthony. I like him. And I think there's upside with him. Again, speaking of looking for the highest upside players, there's huge upside with Roman Anthony, in my opinion. So at 7, the next two hitters for me, or next two outfielders for me, are the more chic names that I think people would look at my list and say you're too low on. But I have reasons for it. I have Walker Jenkins at 7. He was the first round pick out of high school, Carolina High School, of the Minnesota Twins. Very pretty left-handed swing, prototype, right? 6'3", 210, 5th overall pick. Just quote unquote looks like a baseball player. I hate saying that, but that's what people say about him. Pipeline has talked about double plus raw with him. I don't see it when I watch his swing. It's interesting because if we're talking about what others say, Pipeline and Prospectus say two very different things about him. Prospectus is saying, I don't know if the power's there, but the swing is nice and he's going to be a nice player. Whereas Pipeline talks about potential double plus raw. I don't see the double plus raw. I watched him swing the bat a lot. I think you might be projecting because of his size, but I think he's a slower, less talented Max Clark, and not the power of a, Wyatt Langford, right? So this is like a typical Minnesota type player who's not really great and not necessarily a huge fantasy asset. What's his upside, right? To me, it's like a 280 hitter with 22 home runs and 10 stolen bases. And that's not wonderful. I do think his frame, his size, some of the scouting says there might be more power to grow into, but I question whether that's actually the case with him. And that said, he's still, I still have to consider the fact that he was the 5th overall pick and that there are lots of people that like him. I begrudgingly rank him at 7. Who's your 7?
I don't have him on my list.
Nice.
So So yeah, I just don't see like like you were saying earlier, you could get that type of player drafting, trading that's a veteran. So why invest somebody that isn't going to be up in 3 years? That's just going to have that performance of somebody you could get now.
Right.
Number 7, I do have a Minnesota Twin here, because of the high ceiling. So Emmanuel Rodriguez, I think he's fallen off people's some lists radar. I think he's still in the top 50 on most lists though
Mhm.
overall. He came out swinging in 2022, had elite numbers across the board, and then got hurt. So last year was his time back. He was very slow starting because of that. He kind of became a big caution on everybody's list. But I would say he was playing late spring training games last year and hitting the crap out of the ball. I think he had EVs off Garrett Cole and including a home run and fly balls to the outfield that were elite, right, in the 110s.
Mhm.
Obviously Cole is just playing around with his stuff at that point, but still, that's shows kind of the ceiling for him. What
Mhm.
I like about him, and this may kind of point into what some people identify as a weakness. He is a walker. He's always had on base percentage over 400 in his career. Even last year when he struggled, he had a 403 on base percentage. Walks as much as he Ks. His K rate was extremely high at the start of the year, but he got it down under 30%, so he ended up about 29%. He had the highest hard hit rate of most everybody on this list, so 36.5% hard hit rate in the minors, which is elite of elite. The only issue I have with him would be he isn't going to be the 20 steal guy in the outfield. I'd like to look for the high power, high speed guys, and he isn't going to be over 50 with a hit. But I will give him a higher hit because of on base percentage. A single and a walk are basically the same thing, right? Unless somebody's on base. So he's and I also will give a little leniency towards him last year because he did have major knee surgeries, right? And so was it his knee surgery? Was it his knee that was hurt?
Did hurt his knee,
Yeah.
yes.
So it takes a while to come back. I'm going to mention another player that has been severely downgraded and forgotten because of his performance last year, but he was gone for a long, long time, right?
Right.
And that affects coordination, right? I met with a colleague last week. I'm on sabbatical. I haven't been teaching and we were talking about teaching. My brain just wasn't there. I wasn't quick,
Right.
just because I haven't used that part of my brain. And I think that the same thing, people want to. These guys are intelligent. They're smart they're fast thinkers, right? You have to
Mhm.
be. But if you're not using those neurons, it's going to take a while to get them rolling. So
Right.
same thing with Rodriguez. He was out for a whole year. Give him some time. He's in the lower minors. So he's one of those players. I think I have about 4 or 5 that starting February 23rd, I'm going to be watching spring training
For
to see
sure.
what he's showing.
He's such an interesting player to me. So it was a knee in 22 and abdominal injury in 23. Um, like Dominguez, like Max Clark to a certain extent, I do get a little nervous with players who are physically kind of maxed out. He's listed as 5'10", 210. And so you wonder, where does he end up playing ultimately, right? Is it a corner outfield? And if it is he hitting enough to stay? You worry about, you know, a player with that level, that type of swing and miss and high walk rates. Is it 240 with a 350 OBP? Is it 250 with the 370 OBP, right? Because there's a big difference between the two. I also don't love Minnesota's developmental process. And I think they lean so heavily on getting out in front of the ball and lifting and pulling that they lose sight of just being a hitter. And there's a lot of talent. I think there's a lot of talent in that organization who they've wasted in some ways, right? Matt Wallner is not a bad hitter, but
Mm.
he's just a pure power player at this point. Max Kepler, I think, could have been a 260, 270 hitter, but they turned into just dead pull power. Byron Buxton, I think, is the best example. I think Buxton, if you just let him hit the ball hard wherever he hits it, and you're not trying to launch for power, would have been a completely different player. So I wonder with Rodriguez what happens. And then the other thing is, a player with such a high walk rate in the minor leagues, you always have to ask the question, is that going to translate in the bigs? And if a lot of his value is predicated on that walk rate, will you see that value once he's on your team? But he is a part of that big cluster of 55 overalls for me. He did not make the top 10, however. At 8, this is where I put Evan Carter. I know that's controversial to a lot of folks. He is the number 5 overall prospect according to Pipeline. I don't remember where BP has him. I think it's like somewhere between 4 and 7. So I should explain myself, given the fact that he played so well in the major leagues last year, towards the end of the season. I have his risk as low, 2nd round pick out of Tennessee high school. Not a lot of folks saw him before that draft, in part because he's in Tennessee and COVID and everything else. Great eye, right? A lot has been written about his discipline, his the low chase rate. I think it was lower than everybody except Juan Soto for his time in the major leagues. That's a skill, right? That's a really, really important skill, and I'm not going to take that away from him. But I don't see when I talk about the quick twitch of a Max Clark, the quick twitch of a James Wood, a Jackson Chourio, I don't see that with Evan Carter. I see a smooth player and a player who's very smart, but I don't see the power potential and I don't see the speed potential. So when we're talking about Evan Carter as a potential star, what does his stat line look like to you, right? Because for me, he could hit 290, he could hit 300, sure. And he could run a 400 on base percentage. But if you're doing that and you're hitting, say you hit 18 home runs or 20 home runs, and you chip in 10, 15 steals, because I don't think he's nearly as fast as people think he is, where does that rank him, right? When you're comparing him to a J-Rod who has 40-40 potential, or you're comparing him to Ronald Acuna, who's hitting 35-70, or Corbin Carroll, who has, 30-40, 30-50 potential. It's just, that's not who Evan Carter is, right? And so your best case scenario is, like, very best case scenario is like a Juan Soto light, but he's not Juan Soto. So I don't know who he is in the long run, but he's not, what I do know is he's not elite. And I'll stand by that, which is why, should I keep him below Walker Jenkins? Maybe not. Maybe in my update, when we do our top 100, I have him above Jenkins, but am I going to put him above Roman Anthony? Probably not, because Roman Anthony can hit 35 home runs, and I don't think Evan Carter can. The other question about Evan Carter is he's never hit lefties.
Mm-hmm.
He hasn't hit lefties yet. And so, yeah, he's going into his age 21 season. But if you have potential platoon splits because you haven't hit lefties yet, and everyone's anointing you as the next great thing, like, I want to see him hit a left-hander first before we decide that's who he is.
Yeah, what you mean by he doesn't hit lefties? He did this. Texas doesn't give him a chance to hit lefties.
And why is that?
Right?
They don't want to
And that
expose
says a
him.
lot about it. If your org is not going to even let you hit against lefties, then I think that's a huge warning sign.
Yep.
As far as platoon goes.
Do you have
Yeah,
him
so
in the same spot?
I have him at 9. So I did earlier in our home league, I did trade for him. He's part of my Harper deal where I did get better players than him. But one thing that I like about Clark, and I would take a little bit of issue with what you said about speed. His measurable speed was incredible in the majors, right? He was at what 97 percentile. His
Sure.
speed from catcher to first was up there with the Carroll types. The issue I have with his speed is how many chances is he going to get? You got an old school manager of Bochy. He's not in Cincinnati where it's like where they say screw it, we're just going to run everybody, right? Even Spencer Steer, right?
Mhm.
So how many chances is he going to get? He's a great base runner, but I don't see him like, the Victor Scott 80 steal potential in the majors, right? He could hit 40 at some point. But yeah, what scared me and why I ended up trading him was the whole lefty thing. If he struggled versus lefties, no big deal. He's 21. And he was drafted out of high school. He's gonna adjust, right? But the fact that in the majors he wasn't given that shot, nor in the minors. And the scary thing is looking at it's a big red flag to me if somebody's OBP is larger than their slugging
Mhm.
in forming their OPS versus in their splits, and which it was, right? I think his slug was around 300, right, versus
Mhm.
lefties in the minors. So that's a huge concern for me. His power, I don't see him unless he puts on weight. I tried to Google him a lot over the summer as far as weight training. I think he's never done it, is what they've said, and he was going to
Right.
do it over the summer. So I even looked at like a card signing to see if he looked bigger, but he didn't. So anyway, that's how weird we are with fantasy baseball.
Right, exactly.
Looking at these prospects, right? So yeah, I don't. I see him as a solid floor guy that's going to give you steals, but if you want steals and somebody that's not going to hurt you with on base percentage and have contact skills, I would wait a long time for Victor Scott versus Evan Carter.
So I was looking at, I just pulled up the, Fangraphs outfielders, I sorted by Fangraphs WAR, but some of the names that I came up with that I think compare in some, at least in, let's take homers and steals, right? Power and speed. We know fantasy is about power and speed. And we assume Evan Carter is going to be a, floor of a 270 hitter with a double digit walk rate. That's pretty easy to assume that with some upside. But listen to the names and the power and speed that they provided last season and tell me if he's any better than this. TJ Friedel, 18 homers, 27 steals. James Outman, 23 homers, 16 steals. Christian Yelich, 19 homers, 28 steals. Cody Bellinger, 26 homers, 20 steals. Chas McCormick, 22 homers, 19 steals. Josh Lowe, 20 homers, 32 steals, right? Ian Happ, similar player, like high OBP type of player, 21 homers, 14 steals. Lars Nootbaar, who does have platoon splits and a great eye, 14 homers, 11 steals. So I think when we're talking about Evan Carter, let's remember there are a lot of places to find 20 homers and 20 steals in the outfield. There are a lot of players out. Brandon Nimmo is the comp that I love, and he's faster than Nimmo, but Nimmo had 24 homers, 3 steals, 273, 360, 363 OBP, right? Like,
Yeah, he's Nimmo with steals, right?
so why are we, if that's who we think he is, and we don't think he has 35 home run power, what the hell are we talking about him being an elite prospect, right? We're including him in the conversation with Wyatt Langford and Dylan Cruz and Jackson Churio. A lot of folks are. He does not have the athleticism to do that. People are so focused on his ability to not chase. But if you can't impact, even if you can, I can identify a pitch. Maybe my eyesight is great. That doesn't mean I can hit the ball. It just means I can identify the freaking pitch, right? I don't know. It makes me crazy because it's people want, so there are narratives that people want to push. And I think Evan Carter is like the narrative in this outfield group that everybody wants to push and they want to see him succeed. And it's just, I don't see the skills. I may be proven wrong. I don't see it in him. I really don't.
One last thing I want to say about him, this comes to an early lesson that I learned and I still fall into when it comes to kind of that it factor. I call it the David Freese syndrome. There's players at the end of the year and into playoffs that just kick ass, right?
Mhm.
Stats are just off the boards. They seem to come up in clutch moments like Freeze did in the playoffs for St. Louis. But that it factor doesn't necessarily translate into daily performance as a fantasy baseball player, right? So, you know, Carter has the it with clutch. It's hard to argue what he did in the playoffs. But does that translate into daily grind performance? I don't think so. Same thing with David Freese, right? He was MVP of the playoffs and World Series, but he dealt with injuries and he never really, became anything more than a 20 home run third baseman who hit 270, right?
Mhm.
And what was a team leader was that spark, but just not the fantasy baseball player. So that's I think when we go from playoffs, into the next season, that's what's freshest on our memory,
Right.
and so that's why I think he shot up the boards as well as his playoff performance.
Totally. Totally. I remember, Francisco Rodriguez, the reliever for the Angels, was the second coming of Mariano Rivera, right? Because he was so dominant in the playoffs. Or I was just thinking about who was the cornerback for the Cowboys that won the Super Bowl MVP and got the huge contract and was like trash after that. It was Larry Brown, right? Larry
Uh-huh.
Brown was the Super Bowl MVP of Super Bowl 30 and for the Cowboys signed a huge free agent contract with the Raiders and like was a backup basically for the rest of his career. And the people remembered that Super Bowl, and that was what defined him. And so he made a ton of money off of it. That's not to say that's Evan Carter. I think Evan Carter is a fine player, but grade him out as TJ Friedel and Cody Bellinger and Christian Yelich, not Ronald Acuna and Corbin Carroll and Julio Rodriguez, right?
Mhm.
That's my point. Um, so 9 and 10 for me, this is the beginnings of the 55 tier. Overall 55. I'm gonna read the names of all the guys who I have in this bucket.
So you
Before
had 60 all the way up to this point.
yes, so I had
That's
six,
effing crazy for this category for is
I think so
it
too. So I had
is
65. Churio, Cruz, Langford, and Wood were 65. Clark, Anthony, Jenkins, and Carter are 60. And then this next bucket is all 55s. I have Kevin Alcantara, the 6'6 right-handed hitting outfielder for the Cubs. Drew Gilbert of the Mets. Owen Casey of the Cubs. Jet Williams, I classified as an outfielder for the Mets. I think he ends up their center fielder eventually. He's not supplanting Lindor. I think Lindor signed through like 31. And I think Acuna ends up at second base. I do have Emmanuel Rodriguez and Jason Dominguez here. Heston Kierstad, former number 2 pick, left-handed hitter for the Orioles, I have in this bucket. Chase DeLauder, your boy for the Guardians in this bucket. Colton Cowser, and then Pete Crow Armstrong of the Cubs as well. I think he's being overrated a bit on lists because of his outfield defense. He's the one I think of when I speak of our ratings being fantasy ratings versus the overall ratings, including defense, because you can make the case that he's an 80 grade center fielder. And then the two that I have in my top 10 that are 55 overall for me are Victor Scott II, as you've pointed out, of the St. Louis Cardinals, and Josue De Paula, the left-handed hitting Los Angeles Dodgers prospect. Let's start with Scott, since I think we both have Scott in our top 10. Is that right?
yes. Mhm.
So Victor Scott was a mid-round draft pick of the Cardinals out of West Virginia. 23 years old this season. I have his ETA as this season, and I have his risk as low. I think he does not have a super elite ceiling outside of his stolen bases. but I also think that he's going to provide a ton of stolen bases if he gets to play regularly. So 55 hit, I think he's a better hitter than people realize. Line drive hitter, makes a lot of really good contact. I put his power grade as a 45, and I think that's not, I think it might be closer to a 50. And I think it actually has the upside of a 55 power grade because he hits the ball a lot harder than people realize. But this is, you're talking about an 80 grade speed dude, right? This is a legitimate 60, 70, 80 steal a year type of player. Think, and I've seen this written elsewhere, think Esteury Ruiz, but with like some power and a much better hit tool. That's who Victor Scott is. Huge asset on a fantasy team if he's in the outfield with players that can supplement his lack of power, right? It's, you know, again, you have Carroll plus Cruz in their prime, and you add a Victor Scott, you can win stolen bases with those three players alone. And Carroll and Cruz will take care of his power, right? Or an Acuna and a J-Rod, because he has that kind of speed. The difference between Victor Scott and, say, Enrique Bradfield, who was picked by the Orioles out of Vanderbilt in the first round last season, who I have as a 50 overall, is that I think Scott has a little bit more power. I think Scott has a little bit, he has enough power and enough ability to, as a hitter, that you can envision Victor Scott II as the leadoff hitter for the Cardinals, right? Maybe a Mason Wynn behind him, which is a really fun one too. But can you envision Enrique Bradfield with, you know, say single digit power, hitting leadoff for the Orioles on a team with Jackson Holiday and Gunnar Henderson and Adley Rutschman? My answer is no. My answer is I think he's more of a 9 hitter than a 1 hitter. So that's one of the big differentiations for me. But I love Scott. We've talked about it. We joke. One of us is going to end up with Victor Scott in our home league, almost positively. And it would not surprise me to see him open up the year for the Cardinals in center field. He's 23. They need him. I think they're going with some youth. He's exciting. He's explosive. I'm super excited to watch him in spring training and super excited to see what happens with him. They currently have Tommy Edman in center field, according to Fangraphs, and Lars Nootbaar in left, right? With Jordan Walker in right. And their depth in the outfield is Dylan Carlson. There's no reason why Victor Scott does not start this season in St. Louis. With anything to add with Victor Scott for you?
Nope, I have him at 10. I have him obviously above the other speedsters. We got Bradford, and even got Justin Crawford there as well. But his contact is solid. He's gonna walk. That's exactly, I think in the past we've had these speedsters come up that just don't have the promise of getting
Billy
on
Hamilton.
base. Yeah, and Scott finally could be this guy that could get on base and can steal. And with the new rules, I think St. Louis is always kind of ahead of the game. Like Cincinnati, I think they're going to run wild and not necessarily be conservative with Scott. So yeah, I think he's a sleeper. You already snagged him one pick ahead of me in the Dynasty League, and hopefully I can return the favor in the home league, or if somebody else from our home league just happens to be watching this.
Right. I don't know. I hearken to, my own like childhood and players that I followed. I was watching clips of Vince Coleman earlier this week, and Victor Scott II is stockier, right? He's built differently than Vince Coleman, but that idea of a Cardinals outfielder with that kind of speed is just fun. He's a fun player to me. If, in our league where it's 16 teams and 3 outfielders, for Scott to be a bench outfielder and be able to kind of wait on him to start to produce, you could strike gold with a Victor Scott II in a league like ours. So he was your 10. Who's your 9?
My 9's Evan Carter. My 8 was our favorite guy, Chase DeLauder. you had him in the 55s. He's in the 55, 60 range for me. Largely because of not because of his swing, but because of his output thus far. He's
Sure.
on the list of players I want to actually visually see in the spring.
There you go.
He does his, I think, like Langford, like his average EV is affected by the contact and sometimes weak contact. So for instance, Langford, I think, was at 90%
Mhm.
average EV, which is kind of average for an older player. Cruz was at 93 to compare that. But I think that's not because Langford can't do elite EVs, which he does. It's just he makes contact a lot, and sometimes that results in weak contact. So the Lauder has always been kind of the Vinny outfielder type of guy that is going to walk as much as he strikes out, makes great contact. He has a very short follow through on his swing. He's not going to have these the pretty swing with that you see out of these elite lefties. But in Arizona Fall League, he was having elite EVs. He was one of the runner-ups for MVP. If you see video of him, he does have, for a lefty, power to all fields. And he does have decent speed in the 55 to 60 range. He's a matter of debate, not just between us, but between a lot of people coming up. So I think he's going to attract a lot of nerds like us that like fantasy baseball during spring training just to see,
Mhm.
oh, well, is this guy for real or not?
Right.
So yeah, so Chase the Lauder, I had most of these other players kind of in the same range. I do like Owen Casey a lot. He hits the shit out of the ball. Is he going to have is he going to improve the contact is the question. But unlike the Nats, you have the Cubs that maybe could be able to tone that down a little bit because they have better player development.
Mhm.
Um, Spencer Jones is kind of in the same area there as far as the hard hits, big guy, kind of elite EVs. The one person I wanted to mention here, the one player that I wanted to mention, because he used to be at the top of outfield discussion, but he had a run-in with police officers in Arizona, is Christian Robinson. I love Christian Robinson. He was always scouted as having elite power, in the 60s to 75s in his power. His hit was always a question because his K rates, in the high 20 percentile and 30s. Um, Fast, athletic. You talk about twitch. He is elite twitch. His surface numbers last year when he finally did come back. So just to back up a little bit, in 2020 he was at the top of the outfield list, right? Or in the top three. He struggled with mental health issues.
Mhm.
He had an issue with I think a campus police officer in downtown Arizona, lost his visa from the Bahamas and was gone for 3 years, right? Until
Mhm.
last year. He finally got his visa renewed. He came back, produced solid surface numbers, right? His OPS was over 900 across A into, I think he did reach double a high A and then double A. He was hitting the crap out of the ball. Power numbers were up there. He stole a lot. I think he had 23 steals last year. The big issue, of course, was his strikeout rate, which was like 34%. And then his in zone swing and miss was horrible, right?
Right.
But the guy was gone for 3 years, right? Let's give him a break and see what he does. So he's one of these players that I have listed. If I were at spring training, I would go see every game. We know he got the invite a couple days ago. There is a crowd in the outfield there, but he has a ceiling of being a if he works this out, which is a big if, of an easy 30-30 player, right?
Yep. Yep.
Um, Corbin Carroll and Christian Robinson in the same outfield. That's crazy.
It's fun.
So I'm cheering for him. I think I think he could. I think a lot of the lack of recognition of spin is you're gone for freaking 3 years, right? And and let's not forget about how he was originally scouted with his talent. And it's not like he was scouted well and then he played for 3 years and stunk.
Right.
He was out of the game for 3 years. So he's a big sleeper for me in the coming season.
Love it. I love it. The last player in my top 10 is, as I said, is Josue De Paula. Josue De Paula is 18. Slow burn on him if you're willing to invest. Is the cousin of Stephon Marbury and Sebastian Telfair, former NBA point guards. DePaul is interesting. He's 6'3". He's got just a gorgeous left-handed swing. Hit for no power last year in the minors. 2 home runs and 340 plate appearances. Is not very fast. But the swing and the frame say, just beautiful hitter, right? And I think this is if you're in the business of projecting, right, and investing really, really early in trying to find who's the next superstar, it's the kind of player those guys are attracted to, right? This is the kind of player that I look for, is elite upside. Nobody knows about him. Let me take a chance on him now, and hopefully literally 3-4 years from now, this plays out. But I think he has like 65 hit, 65 power potential. This is a potential 300 hitter with 30 to 35 home runs. That's the kind of skill he has, without any speed really to speak of, probably playing a corner outfield, right? But it says something that, last year as a 17-year-old, he was the 7th rated prospect in the Dodgers system, according to Pipeline. And this is a player who can't field very well, right? And then you have a BP comes out, Baseball Prospectus, this year, and De Paula is the number 2 prospect in the Dodgers organization, according to BP. There's something there, and when you watch him swing, you see it. There's something there that says to you, this dude could be an absolute superstar, right? And so I love him. You know that. I rostered him last season. I wish I could keep him. I will draft him if I redraft him in our league if I can. But if I'm comparing him to Cowser or some of the others, even an Owen Casey or a Drew Gilbert. Gilbert's like, say, 15-15, right? You're going to get 15-15 from Gilbert. Jet Williams is probably 10 to 15 homers and 30 steals with regular time. Jason Dominguez is probably, 25-15 or 25-10. You go down that list, and there's, outside of maybe Emmanuel Rodriguez, I don't see that kind of upside. But I see it when I scout De Paula. I see it when I see him swing the bat. And that's the difference for me between being in the top 10 and being outside of the top 10.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have anything to add with De Paula?
I like him a lot, and I would bank it on too, on the reputation of the very same people at BP and BA who are in charge of international prospects. The very same people that identified Caminero and those types are saying the same thing about De Paula. So for me, that weighs heavy, right? And so, and then you got the Dodgers too, who you can be confident in their ability to identify that. So there's players that come up that may not necessarily have these spicy stats initially, that you just know are going to be good, that based upon their swing, their scouting, and how they hit the ball, their contact, and their hard hit. So yeah, he's one to keep a keen eye on.
If everyone's in agreement about a guy, a corner outfielder who is 18 years old in the Dodgers system, if everyone's in agreement that he's high up on these lists already at 18, in a system with a lot of pretty good players still, it's sign me up for that, right? That's the kind of thing I'm looking for, where it's not some people think he's great and some people think he's not. It's everyone across the board agrees that this guy's a ton of talent.
Mm.
But I'm excited. I mean, it's funny because I look at this list and there's tremendous, this is like the future of fantasy baseball, right? Churio, Cruz, Langford, Wood, Clark, Anthony, Jenkins, Carter. But the two players on the list that get me most excited, that I'm like most drawn to and pumped about, are Victor Scott II and Josue de Paula. And I don't know, maybe that's rooting for the underdog. Are there any?
But that's what makes it so fun, right? Is being able to track these players early. It's part of I think we've talked about this before. We all have the information. I think after you play this for a while, the ego thing of, oh, I found this player first kind of just goes out the door, just
Sure.
because it's just, but what's fun about it is not necessarily I saw this player first, but just tracking them, right? Seeing their growth, right? Is part of our brains, is just wanting to see other human beings, succeed and use their uber talents for good, right? So anyway, yeah, so this guy came up because we're drafting in our Dynasty league right now, and we're looking for deep prospects. And I kept putting this guy's name in because the same people who identified Caminero and DePaula are talking about this guy this year. And damn it, I kept thinking I was misspelling the name because it sounds a lot like Colossus. And so it didn't come up because you have him already rostered. It's Robert Colossus for Colorado Rockies. This is the international prospect name that people think are going to jump this year, the DePaula of 2024. So just want to note that as well.
Were you, what was your reaction when you kept looking for him and you couldn't find him, and then you saw him on my roster?
Yeah, it was like, well, I don't know, I'd move on, right?
That's funny.
Yeah, there's a few players, there's people there that I thought may roster him, but the way people are, some of these deeper, like in Dynasty, these deeper international prospects are just ignored, right? Like even DeVries went pretty late in our Dynasty
Right.
FYPD draft, and even the Atlanta guy Perdomo is still
Still
undrafted.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought he was going to be there, but he wasn't.
That's funny. So I do have a bucket of 50 overall players that I think are worth mentioning. And I will say, like, I'm down on Gabriel Gonzalez, who was traded from the Mariners to the Twins. And I have to differentiate between him leaving the team that I root for and study and talk about versus who the player actually is, right? But in my list of 50 overall, I have Yanquiel Fernandez for the Rockies, Justin Crawford, Drew Jones, Gabriel Gonzalez, Jordan Beck, outfielder for the Rockies, who I do think is a name to watch this season. Spencer Jones, I'm probably low man on Spencer Jones. Johnny Farmelo, first round pick of the Mariners last year, very, very athletic player. Miguel Blaze, who I rostered at the beginning of last season, I think is still very talented, but got hurt. Elijah Green may be such a slow burn with the Nationals that we don't think about him until 26, but still was a top 5 pick and very talented. Enrique Bradfield, as I spoke of earlier, and Denzel Clark of the Oakland Athletics. Those are all players in my 50 overall bucket. There's just a ton of outfielders, right? And to me, this is the most fun position thus far. I think this is like the future of fantasy baseball is in this, right, on this list. Is there, we always end this way, is there anyone who on this list who's your personal favorite that you feel is overrated or that you feel is vastly underrated that you want to mention?
Yeah, the it's hard to say Cruz is underrated, but I just think he was overshadowed, and just because Langford had such a great performance. But yeah, I think Cruz is forgotten as far as how elite he could be. And my personal favorite would be Wood, just because again the Nats bias there, but I just love his athleticism. I was really excited when they did make that trade. I just want the Nats to get it together, man. You mentioned
Right.
Elijah Green. What about Robert Hassel?
Yeah.
Hassel was on the top of this list 2 years ago himself, right?
Mhm.
Nobody's going to question his hitability, his acumen, his skill, his swing. Just come on, I'm glad they're moving on from the former development, but let's go, Nats. You gotta develop this talent. Is not because you misidentified talent here.
Right. I agree. I'd say my two favorites are Scott and DePaula, as I've said. I do think Evan Carter and Walker Jenkins are both overrated, um, for reasons that will remain unnamed on this podcast. And
Well, one player I forgot that I
sure.
ripped on all last year because his splits stunk was Colton Cowser. I do want to give a shout out that he did improve lefty on lefty last year. And then the BA that BA article I was referring to, he just missed from this year, right? He had a
Mhm.
great AAA.
Mhm.
I was kind of hoping he was the guy that was traded in Milwaukee, but we knew that wasn't the case just because Milwaukee's overloaded with outfield right now.
Right.
I kind of hope he does get traded, but not to Miami because
Right.
that's not a good hitters. But it's 70% contact rate, 20% chase rates,
Mhm.
19% in zone.
Mhm.
His EVs were elite, 91.4 average, 105, 90%. And then again, as I said, he actually did hit lefties last year. So
Mhm.
I just want to give a shout out there since I did downgrade him last year. I would upgrade him, and he does meet those qualifications. The players that BA identified this year as meeting those qualifications were Junior Caminero, Wyatt Langford, Noelvi Marte, Colt Keith, and Michael Bush. All meet those
Huh.
standards across the board.
Interesting. Interesting. This was fun, man.
And Cal was the other one.
We going starting pitching?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
You want to do top 10 or do you want to do split lefty and righty?
I think top 10 is fun.
Cool. Works for
Yeah.
me. This is
All right.
fun. Appreciate it,
All
brother.
right. Take it easy.
You
Enjoyed
too,
it.
man. You too.